So for nearly 2 decades of my adult life, I've been reading an average of 100 books every year. And in today's video, I want to give you 5 tips for how you can read more than you ever thought possible. So let's jump into it. Welcome back to Read Like a Man. If you're new here, my name is Paige, and on this channel, I help you expand your best thinking primarily through the books that you ingest and the books that you make part of your life. And so what I want to talk about today is how to read more than you ever thought possible. There's a ton of people who have grasped the importance of reading, and no matter how many books they currently read, they know they should, and they also want to read more. This is a search topic that just keeps going up and up and up, and people keep asking me about it, so I decided to give you 5 of my best tips for this today. So the very first step to reading more is determining why you want to read more in the first place. A lot of people, their why is just, especially if you're not currently a reader, your why is that you feel like you should read. Like everybody tells you should read. The people that you look up to say you should read, and you know you need to, and so your why is just like, well, it's kind of like a peer pressure thing. That doesn't count as a why. That's not an intrinsic actual motivation, right? So we got to set that one aside, and we're going to look at 4 internally motivated whys as to what would be driving you to become a reader or to read more than you currently do. The first one is the why of entertainment. This is what I would call a bad why, and it's really weird because so much of the people, so much of the group of people who read currently, they read for entertainment, and that's why they try to encourage people to read. It's like, oh, it's so entertaining. Here's this cool story. Here's this whatever. But as a foundational why for getting into reading, entertainment is like the worst possible reason. And it's simply because like there's so many other things that are so much more entertaining than reading. Right? Like a movie is way more entertaining than a book, and a video game is way more entertaining than a movie, and a VR video game is way more entertaining than a regular video game, right? So if your goal is just entertainment, in and of itself, reading is not a very good option. It's pretty difficult and takes practice to learn to be entertained through reading, because even though you are ingesting the words on a page of a story, you have to imagine the things that are happening if you want to see anything, right? So the why of just entertainment is not a great why. And what we want to do is go to a higher or a deeper, however you want to figure that, reason why, as to why do you want to read more? So the next why that I want to talk about is knowledge, right? And this is where we get into what I would call a good why, right? Wanting to read in order to gain knowledge, to gain facts about stuff that has happened, about the current state of things, is a pretty decent why, right? But again, it's not the best one, because there's also lots of other really effective ways to gain knowledge and facts, right? And as far as efficiency goes, there's lots of other ways that are even more efficient for gaining all the facts, right? So the why of knowledge is good, but yeah, that's about it, right? The next why that I want to talk about is wisdom. You could want to read more in order to gain wisdom. And this is where we get to what I would consider to be a better why, because wisdom takes all of the facts of knowledge and correctly interpolates and interrelates them into a understanding of the world that can then be used to make better decisions in life, right? So if knowledge is just knowing all the facts, wisdom is knowing what to do with all the facts and with all the knowledge, and how they relate, even in ways where they may not seem to relate right at first, right? So the goal of wanting to read in order to become wise is what I would consider a better why. But it is not what I would consider to be the best why. The best why you could have for wanting to read more is for soul transformation, right? And this is where you understand that I want, through the experience of engaging with the good, the true, and the beautiful in the written word, I want my soul to be deeply transformed, and therefore my life to be deeply transformed, because I did the work of engaging with this thing, right? That is the ultimate why. That is the ultimate reason for reading. That is what this book that I just finished, Jessica Houghton Wilson, she talks about reading as a spiritual practice, right? So that is reading for spiritual formation. So that is the highest level of why that you could have for wanting to become a reader. And the reason why I start out with this, the reason why I start out with why do you want to read more in the first place, is your commitment level to putting forth the work that it will take to become a better reader who reads more is directly proportionate to the depth or height, however you want to do it, of the why that you have. So a bad why of entertainment, very little commitment. A good why of knowledge, a little bit more commitment. A better why of wisdom, lots of commitment. The best why of soul formation is all the commitment necessary, right? So before you can just be like, oh, I want to read more, you have to understand, why do I want to read more? And then you will have a realistic view of how willing you will be to put up with the hardship of developing yourself into someone who does read more, because it is hard work. Okay. And that leads me into point number 2. And the second point is that you have to recognize that you are going to suck at it at first. I guarantee you. And the reason for this is because modern living has made it such that the average attention span is anywhere between 8 to 10 seconds. It's down from 12, what it used to be a couple of years ago. And now most people say it's 8. It's really even kind of a little bit less than that in a lot of ways. Like all the YouTube experts will tell you, like for video stuff, it's down to 3 seconds. Like if you don't hook somebody in the first 3 seconds, you're screwed, right? So what you have to understand with this is that the number one factor in reading is focus. You have to be able to focus. If you can't focus, you can't read, right? And focus and attention span are basically the same thing, right? If your attention span is only 8 seconds long, it means you can only focus for 8 seconds, right? The thing that you need to realize is that if you want to just sit down and read for 20 minutes a day, which is a great goal, right? That's a really solid, like if you sit down and read for 20 minutes, you are doing so much better than basically everyone that you know, right? But what I want you to understand with that is that sitting down and reading for 20 minutes means you're sitting down and focusing for 150 times longer than the average attention span. Right? And the thing is, whenever we hear an average number, we all think that we're above average, right? We're like, well, I mean, that's the average, but like, I'm not an average driver, right? And there's numbers on this that I think it's like 85% of people, if they self-report, they say that they're an above average driver, right? So it's like 85% of people think that they're above, like that those numbers don't actually work, right? We all think we are better than we actually are. And so one of the things that you need to just accept in the beginning is, even if you do have a longer attention span than the average, do you think that your attention span is currently 150 times more than the average? Because that's what it's going to take to just sit down and read for 20 minutes a day, right? If you want to really get serious and you want to sit down and read for an hour a day, right? Which is like, now you're getting into kind of top tier reader level stuff, right? But if you're going to read for an hour a day, you have to have an attention span that's 450 times longer than the average, right? So to go into this thinking that I can just sit down and decide like, oh man, I'm just gonna sit down and read for 20 minutes. Like, you're not. If you have not constantly and consistently been building up the ability to focus for large amounts of time, you are guaranteed to be much closer to that 8-second range than you are to the 20-minute range of your ability to focus. And that's okay, right? It's not okay to stay there because that's horrendous. You cannot live a good life with an 8-second attention span, right? But you do have to recognize where you are. So you sit there and you're like, okay, you know what? Maybe you're 10 times better than the average person. That means you can sit down and read for 1 minute and 20 seconds before your attention is taken somewhere else and before you lose focus, right? So it's this thing where you have to realistically assess, where am I starting from and what is a realistic goal for starting to build the practice and the habit of focus. Because I guarantee if you're not a consistent reader already, you do not have any habitual practice of focusing. You just don't. Nobody does, right? So if you're going to start to do this, you have to build it slowly. You have to build it semi-realistically, right? And you have to be willing to celebrate the the small wins, where it's like, dude, even if you read for 10 minutes, right? That's still 75 times more than the average attention span, right? That's an amazing, amazing feat if you consider where you're coming from. So first off, the second point, again, is you just have to recognize that you're going to suck at it at first because you suck at focusing. All of us do. And the only way to get better at it is to practice focusing. And you can't go from 1 to 450x overnight. It just doesn't work that way. You have to build up the muscle and the ability to focus over time. And the third thing that I want to talk about is start with something simple, not something easy. Okay. This is a little bit more to the people who already read anyways. And it kind of goes back to this thing where because a lot of people have the primary reason for reading as an entertainment, right? That's their why for reading. They tend to read things that are easy, right? And then if you are listening to book recommendations from somebody who reads primarily with a entertainment-based why, they will recommend things that are easy, right? But you don't want things that are easy, you want things that are simple, okay? And the difference between these two is super important. So an easy book is a book that doesn't have anything difficult in it, right? It doesn't deal with difficult concepts. It doesn't deal with difficult words. It doesn't deal with difficult storylines or difficult underlying subtext things or messages or lessons or anything like that, right? It has nothing difficult in it. It's all just super surface and easy. Whereas a simple book takes a bunch of difficult things and it distills them down as far as possible in order to make them building blocks that you can then use to build future knowledge on. Okay. So an easy book has nothing difficult in it. A simple book has incredibly distilled difficult things in it. Right. And there's two examples that I want to give for this. One is in the book sense. If you take something like any kind of popular like mystery book from recent years, there's Netflix is coming out with the Woman in Cabin 10. And so that book, if you read that book, there's no real any depth to it, right? It's a real fast page turner and it's a real like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? Bah, right? But there's nothing really deep to it. That I read that book and there was no quote in it, no line in it, no thought in it at any point, that I'm like, wow, man, I really need to come back to that, right? As opposed to if you take a book like this is Bendigo Shafter by Louis L'Amour, right? This book is almost as easy to read as The Woman in Cabin 10. It's not quite as much of a page turner, cliffhanger at every end of every chapter, right? But super easy to read. Like no matter how much you read, you could read this and you could read this story, right? But this book is chock full of things that I don't think it'll focus here. Things that I have dog-eared, right? And like one of these quotes, just picking a random quote out of this book, right? There's this part where the guy says, "You've been reading a lot, Plutarch and the like. Well, the old Romans built what they had by being strong, inside as well as out, and they lost it when they began giving in, going the easy way. They lost everything, Ben, when they ceased to be men, and a man is one who does what he has to do when it has to be done, and does it with pride." Right? And so there's this thing where that's not a complicated sentence, right? You're not reading freaking, de Tocqueville over here where you're like trying to understand this long run-on sentence or whatever. Like anybody can understand that sentence, right? But the meat of it and what underlies it and this concept of this is what makes a man, someone who does what needs to be done when it needs to be done, and he does it with pride just because of doing it. Like he takes pride in the fact that he did it and that he did it well, regardless of what anyone else thinks or does or whatever, right? This idea of this is a simple book, but it's because it takes the complex and complicated things and it distills them down into their purest forms so that you can start to grab them and make them building blocks that you build future knowledge upon, right? And another really quick example with this, but it was so potent the other day. My family ended up watching, because it was kind of a mistake, we ended up watching a 2011 version of the Winnie the Pooh cartoon. And then we went back and watched the original 1970 or whatever it was version of the Winnie the Pooh cartoon. And we got done with it and I was like, oh my gosh, I asked my kids, I was like, which one was better? And they were like, the first one by so much better, right? But the idea behind it was that they're like exactly the same story. They're the same characters. They're the same kind of overarching general storyline, right? But in the new one, there is no nuance to it. There's no underlying subtle messaging to it. There's no deep questions that it brings up. There's no wrestling with what it means to be unique, but also to love other people's uniqueness and all this stuff. It's just a story where it's like, oh, something happens and they think Tigger is a monster, and then Tigger's not really the monster, and then Tigger gets lost, and then they find him, and then the end, right? And it has the same story arc beats, but it's completely easy. There's nothing difficult in it at all, as opposed to the original one where it's like, I can sit here and even though it's so simple that my kids can enjoy it, I can sit here and ask these really deep, insightful, thoughtful questions that make them think about deeper things, because the original story took these complicated things and distilled them down, as opposed to just dumping them all aside and just filling the whole thing with fluff and easiness that has no depth to it at all, right? So third point, I know I kind of of belabored that one. But third point, start with something simple, not freaking something easy. Easy is stupid and lame. All right. And then the fourth thing, and this gets a lot more on the practical side of stuff, but use focus assists. Okay. A focus assist in a camera when you're filming something, focus assist is when you have little lines that show up on whatever part of the image is in focus. And it's a way to help you if your eyesight is kind of bad or just, if you just want the help for it, it's a way to help remind you, hey, this is what the camera is looking at and focusing on, right? So focus assists are things that help you keep your focus where you want it to be. Okay. So the first thing that I would say for that is, when you read, have a pen. I literally don't have a pen anywhere. What the heck? Okay. So have a pen and follow along with the words that you're reading. And I hate this. I did not do this for so long in my life. I rebelled against this. I thought it was like the worst, dumbest, like you suck at reading if you have to use your finger to trace the words that you're reading. And then as I read more and more and understood what we know from the science of how you remember stuff and how you stay focused and whatever, one of the biggest helps in maintaining your focus is taking that finger and flowing it along as you're reading. And another really fun fact with this is like when it comes to speed reading and stuff, but it's that your eyes can't by default move in a smooth pattern. So if you try to make a circle with your eyes, just sitting here and like looking, you'll see that your eyes kind of bounce point to point to point to point to point to point to point. Whereas if you follow my finger, right, and I make a circle with my finger, your eyes will perfectly smoothly follow the motion of my finger, right? So it is immensely helpful when you're reading to use some kind of pointer and follow along with the words that you're reading. It helps your mind stay focused on this is what I'm supposed to be focusing on right now, right? So that's the first focus assist that I want to say. The second one is something that I use all the freaking time, right? And this is I will get the audiobook for the book that I'm reading, and then I will listen to it while I am also physically reading the book. I do this so often, and it helps so much because one, it's a secondary reinforcement, right? Because now you're hearing it as well as reading it and viewing it, but also it acts as a blocker of all the other external noise and all the external factors, right, that are trying to distract you. And it helps you stay focused for longer. Again, you cannot read without focusing, and focusing is the biggest skill that we have lost in modern life. Okay. So anything you can do to help yourself focus better, you need to be doing it because everything else in the entire world is against you, right? So read with a pen, read with a pointer, listen to the book if you can get it. And if you can't get the book, the next best thing, if you have stuff going around like me, I have 5 kids in the house, 6 other people in the house all the time. And there's just noise a lot. And if I'm having a hard time blocking out the noise, I will also put headphones on and then just find whatever music service you use, search for like meditation playlists, right? And these are very atmospheric, just pads, no real melodies, anything like that, right? And have something like that where it's essentially just white noise that's blocking out all of the other noise around you. Again, you have to limit distractions left, right, and center all the time and try to do anything you can to help assist you in focusing. And then the final tip that I have is that you need to forget about remembering everything. Okay. One of the curses that we have with reading is that we think that if we don't have a photographic memory and if we can't remember everything that we read, like it was a waste. Like we think that the goal of reading the book is so that I can regurgitate absolutely everything from the book, right? And that's just not the case. If we go back to determining your why. The thing about the whys, right? We have entertainment, knowledge, wisdom, and soul formation. The thing about the whys is that each one of those whys is focused on a different thing. And so the other reason why I had you figure out what your why is because your why helps determine what it is that you need in order to test whether you remember the appropriate thing from this book, right? Because you're never going to remember everything, and it's stupid to try to read to remember everything. You can't do it, right? So if you are reading with the why of entertainment, then the thing that you need to be able to remember about this book is how I felt reading it. Did I feel scared when I should feel scared? Did I feel excited when I should feel excited? Did I feel connected to the characters? Did I feel elated at the thing? Did I feel completely disconnected and like I didn't care about what happened to anybody, right? If your why for reading is entertainment, then the only thing that you need to remember when you go back and look at, oh yeah, I read this book, is how did that book make me feel in the moment? Did it do what it set out to do of drawing me into this story and making me feel the appropriate things at the appropriate times, right? That's what you need to focus on remembering if you're reading for entertainment. If you're reading for the why of knowledge, then you need to focus on remembering the facts that you learned from the thing, right? So this is much more, appropriate if you're like trying to pass a test in school or whatever type thing, where, you're going to be tested on what date was this painting painted? What date did the Civil War start? What date did this happen? What name is this painting? Whatever, right? And if you are reading for the express purpose of knowledge, then it becomes very important to remember exact facts, right? And so you need to be able to look back at a book and rattle off whatever the pertinent facts were from that book that you had read. This was the day that the Civil War started. This was the day that the attack on Fort Sumter started. This was the name of the general who was in charge of whatever, right? If you're reading for knowledge, you have to be able to recall the exact facts that you were looking to learn when you went into the book in the first place, okay? If you're reading for the why of wisdom, when you go back and look at the book, you need to be able to express the deeper meaning and messages of the book and how it connects to other things in life, right? So rather than going in and being like, this is the date that this started, this is the date that this happened, this is the general who was in charge of this, blah, 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 right? You can look at it and you can say, okay, well, what I remember about this book, The Demon of Unrest, is that there's this parallel to our time with like how it seems like a lot of people view President Trump that was something that President Lincoln had to deal with, right? Because he had all these people who had this view of him that he was completely for abolition and was like going to, release all the slaves immediately the day he got inaugurated, and that he was going to force interracial marriage and all this stuff, right? And they had this view of him in their mind that was completely disconnected from reality of anything that he had ever said and anything that he had ever promised, right? But they had this view and they wanted to continue on in their view of him. And so no matter what he said, they were just like, yeah, but we know for sure that this is what you're going to do, right? And so you can start to see, oh, here's these parallels where history repeats itself and where history rhymes, right? And you can start to dig in and question like, oh, what does that look like? And how do people fall into this thing? And do I fall into that thing? Is there someone that I see, that I know, that like I feel I'm against? Is there someone that I look at them and someone who is on their side would look at me and be like, why do you think that? She has never said that. He has never said that. Like, why do you hold this idea, right? And so wisdom is being able to look at the book and talk about the deeper meaning, the deeper messages, and how it interrelates and interconnects with everything else in your life, right? And then the final one, if you're reading for soul formation, what you need to be able to do is pick up a book and tell someone how it impacted you. Right? Because the why of soul formation is to have your soul formed and transformed by exposure to the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? If that's why you're reading, then when you pick up a book and you go to talk about it, you don't have to remember, oh, this is exactly the storyline of this, and Ben is this character and he married Sally and blah, 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 right? As much as you need to be able to pick it up and go, this is how this book changed me and impacted me. It made me think about, like for me, Bendigo Shafter, like it made me think about what does it mean to be a violent man in service of peace, right? And where's the line between being violent for violence sake or being violent because you like to be violent or because it fulfills something inside of you versus being violent for the good and love of others? And can you ever be violent and forceful out of love? Can it ever be motivated by that, right? And then as my sons are growing up and growing older, it made me think about like, man, what is their journey going to look like? Because there comes a point where every boy, in order to become a man, has to come to this point where he's got to go and do something for himself, right? Bendigo had to go off and he went and got a bunch of cattle and brought them all the way back down from this across multiple states to get back to where they were. And he had this whole long journey. And when he came back, he wasn't the boy that left. He was a man that came back, right? And so what's that journey going to look like for my sons? And like, how can I help them in that? And is that something that's my responsibility to lead them into? Or is it just something that, I just kind of need to set back and be hands off on, right? It's all these deep questions, right? How do I teach my sons, what it means to be a man, and that a man is someone who does what he has to do when it needs to be done and does it with pride? How do I teach my sons to have pride? Isn't pride a sin? Is there such thing as good pride? Is there bad pride, right? And it brings up all these things where if you are reading for soul transformation, your discussion about the book and what you remember about the book doesn't have to be these other things, the facts of it or the storyline of it or whatever. You have to be able to talk about, this is how this book formed me. And so as you go to read more, right? And like for me, like I read 100 books a year, right? I don't remember the plots of every single book that I read. I don't remember all the main points of every single book that I read, but that's not my goal. My goal is to be able to pick up any book in anywhere of our house. And if I have read it, to sit down and have a conversation with somebody and say, yeah, this is how this book impacted me. Here's one thing that I remember, one takeaway that I had from this book, right? And if you let go of the pressure to needing to remember everything, then you can just engage with this book right now for how you need it. And you can get the one thing out of it that you're supposed to get right now. And you can actually allow that to change you. And then when you go back and you try to talk to somebody about it, it's easy to remember because you're like, yeah, I mean, my life is different in this way because I read this book, right? So forget about remembering everything. Figure out what your why is, and then figure out what you need to remember in order to align with that why, and then just focus on remembering those things. All right, hopefully that was helpful to you. If you need some recommendations for books to check out, I've got this video right here about books that Charlie Kirk recommended and some of my favorite ones from his list that I have read. So check this one out next if you need some good recommendations. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.